Gabriel, can you pick up from me? Because they don't have my slides. So I'm going to give the mic to Gabriel, and because this is his presentation, I will go look for mine afterwards.
All right. First, let me apologize for my voice. I've been talking all day, and I picked up a little bit of a cold on the flight over here. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the China Rework, really about how sort of the road to release and where we plan to go from here, and some sort of advice for other people who might take up modding, other mod teams. Because really, there's an aspect to modding that isn't commonly covered. A lot of people think about code when they think about modding, but ultimately, when you're dealing with something as big as Kaiserreich, you also have to think about how you're actually going to organize a team of people to make something like this. But first, we're going to get started really with what is the China Rework. It's really a comprehensive reconstruction of China. We're taking into account a lot of things here. For one, all of the existing work that already existed. Kaiserreich is something with a history going back to 2005 or so. And although we weren't really very happy with how things were prior to the rework, with what we call legacy China, we nonetheless wanted to incorporate some real sort of pillars and key aspects of that experience into what we're creating now. On top of that, there's just a level of past tradition, the way we approach designing Kaiserreich in general. And then also, we just have this new emphasis on plausibility. A lot of people like to say realism, but that's kind of a difficult term because we're not dealing with something real. We're basing everything off of a series of points of divergence. So, really, the history of the China Rework is long, and it was a bit of a bumpy road. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I can say that in general, we got started around 2012. And I say we, but that's not really quite accurate because I wasn't even involved back then. Really, it was just some forum discussions in 2012. And you can only really see something that resembles what we have today emerge around 2015. And then you have to go on a few more years until, in 2016, really, something like, more like what we have today was coming together, but it was for Darkest Hour. And so it was really only with the release of Hearts of Iron 4 that we were really able to start moving things to, an experience that's really recognizable as what we have today. We had an unfortunate experience where a number of people sort of left the team who were really key to this development. That's sort of where I came into things around 2 to 3 years ago. We're hoping for a 2019 release, by the way. So here you can kind of see how things were with that Darkest Hour experience. Kind of basic, but it has a pretty strong resemblance to what you'll see right now. Here is that legacy China ported to Hearts of Iron 4, something you guys are probably pretty familiar with. But here is the rework China, which hopefully most of you guys are also pretty familiar with because we've been sort of putting out maps like this for quite a while. What you might not have seen before, though, is something like this. Because we're really trying to introduce something that has a lot of different potential paths, all these different options for how China can turn out, how all these different factions can align. And we're really trying to add this level of narrative to it. And so we are lucky to have the people from Kaiserreich Cinema providing us with some really great sort of visual accompaniment. So you can see some of our work here, which hopefully will later end up in a World of Kaiserreich video. This is for the Fengtian or Fengtian government. My pronunciations will not be 100% accurate dealing with Mandarin. And then here we have the Qing Empire. So we're hoping to bring this all to the table. But unfortunately, China's had some inherent challenges. For one thing, there's sort of the sheer size and scale of what we're dealing with. There's the fact that it's a sort of historical estuary where you have these weird elements of history kind of blending together all at the same time and in the same place. You have people who are living much like people were 2,000 years ago, right alongside people with sort of the latest technology, radios, machine guns, all those sorts of things. That presents interesting challenges when dealing with Hearts of Iron 4. You have what you might call non-state or quasi-state actors. So in sort of political science speak, that means people who don't necessarily subscribe to modern ideas of what a nation-state or a country should be. People who are operating at different levels of the hierarchy and who may actually have outsized power for what role they're supposed to have. On top of that, you have contradictory source material. I'll get more into detail on that in just a moment. To give a sense of size and scale, though, you can kind of see that here. We're talking about a really huge place, and even bigger back then, because transportation wasn't great. The sort of China theater of World War II has been compared favorably to the Eastern Front. There was a terrible lack of roads. Sort of, fast transport was limited to railways. And so you can see it would take you close to a month to get across the width of the country, and still almost a week to get from the top to the bottom using really the latest trains at the time. But also you have kind of a scale in terms of all of the people present. This is an excellent source we were able to use called Who's Who in China. And this was basically almost like an address book or an encyclopedia of all the people that were present at this time. And this thing is like 500 pages long. Each page, with a good like 9 people on it potentially. So we're dealing with a massive cast of potential characters. When I'm talking about this historical estuary, you can kind of see it in some of these pictures. You have guys with spears. You have, people with guns. You have these amazing sort of modern streets with, bright lights and everything. But you also have people walking around with sort of very basic farming implements. You also have the latest of industry right next to the same kind of thing. When it comes to these non-state or quasi-state actors, you have some other things too, because we're dealing more with warlords here than what we'd recognize as real countries. And what that means is it's really these single individuals with networks of influence and power. A sort of way to term this in Chinese might be guanxi. And so you have them interacting with this whole field of people who are kind of hard to represent through what Hoi4 brings to the table, because it's for dealing with sort of modern countries. But you have not just what I have right here. You've also got all these other elements. And then you also have to keep in mind that each of these guys, say this warlord's inner circle or all of the politicians he has ties with, they've all got their own circles too. So we have to take that into consideration when we're modding all of this stuff, because it's really key to how China works. Another problem is contradictory source material. There's a historian called Russell Shorto, who specializes actually in Dutch history. But he has a great quote, which is basically that people often mistake history for what happened. If you went to PDX-CON today and asked everybody, what did you experience? Everybody's going to tell a slightly different story. And then, how many people here are actually going to write down what happened? Probably a pretty small minority. Then go forward 100 years from now, how many of those accounts are actually going to survive? So we have a pretty good picture of what happened, but that doesn't mean we know everything. And then with China, you have to put that through the lens of competing ideological factors. Neither the KMT, the Kuomintang, or the PRC, the People's Republic of China today, neither of them really like the warlords very much, perhaps for a good reason. But that meant that their own histories of this period are colored by their own sorts of biases and things, which we also have to take into account. So we have some solutions to this problem. We've done a lot of research. I can't emphasize that enough. We've tried to really build the narrative, as I mentioned, with all of these events, decisions, and influence systems. So some of you guys might know that some of our tags already operate more through the use of the political wheel, not so much as representation of politics, but actually of influence of different factions in the government. We also are lucky enough to have an absence of sort of financial pressure. We have a huge team, and we have a sort of fair amount of time. So we're able to put together something really great for you, almost sort of through brute force in that respect. Now I'm going to move on to these modding challenges a little bit, because these are something, again, that I think people don't touch on so much. One of these is simply that interest is variable. Different people are here to do different things. Different people have different specific interests. Some people may also have an interest one day. Next week, who knows? And that's a bit of a challenge. The other section, though, are really things where these all interconnect. You might notice I put this sort of red box around them. And so in this case, the solutions to these problems, which I'll cover in just a minute, are kind of all intertwined. There's the fact that coder availability is variable, which ties a little bit into that interest issue. But also, a lot of us are full-time students or even have full-time jobs. And so we can't necessarily all afford to spend the same amount of time at the same times. On top of that, in sort of extreme cases, coders can disappear entirely. I mentioned earlier that actually happened to the China team when 2 of our most important people disappeared. We've actually had that happen multiple times as part of why the China Rework has taken quite so long. But also, progress is kind of difficult to track. There's also this issue of project creep, or sort of feature creep, though of course we can't actually introduce features as such into something like a mod. When it comes to some of these challenges, just my general advice would be that you have to recognize that you can only control so much directly. This is really from the position of somebody in a position of leadership to a certain degree. So really the best thing to do is to sort of delegate and determine what you actually can control, versus what you aren't able to. And you sort of there you have to mitigate insofar as you're able. So we have a couple solutions to this problem. One is to provide some sort of foundational material. And the solution here was a China timeline and a China map that we were able to use to sort of introduce people to this setting, to the sort of foundational concepts, so they had something to sort of hook onto and use as a sort of understanding of what they could develop from. Because if you just kind of dump somebody into the deep end of all of this information, say you're a modder with your own idea of what the world should look like, what you want your mod to be, and you just say, hey, go out and work on my thing. Well, if you don't have something to sort of serve as a foundation for that, you're going to have some issues. Leaving room for independent development is also important, though. If you're sort of trying to dictate exactly what someone should do, then you're going to have problems as well, because typically, people have their own visions. And because we're all based on inspiration and we're all based on passion, well, people aren't going to be so passionate if you're dictating specific things for them to do. People don't really like to be treated like code monkeys. So another key here is really to craft a clear narrative with what I'd call sort of visual hooks. And I'd like to think that we've done that with China. This was a bit of a challenge, and so you might recognize, if you've been following us on Reddit, some of these images. And these were kind of an attempt by me to try and build that narrative sense. So these were a series of sort of ahistorical or alt-historical sort of news and textbook and in-universe pieces of information. They were supposed to provide some kind of historical grounding for people's understanding of how things happen in the China Rework, sort of the ground level of where things build from. But also, I created this image, which we're now going to be using as our sort of menu background, which was supposed to be a little bit of another one of these sort of visual hooks, where people can look at this image and see all the various things around and think, wow, I wonder what this is about, or I wonder what that is about. And of course, if you play our China Rework, you get to find out all of that. Also, though, when it comes to a lot of these issues, another solution is delegation and focus. So sub-regional heads of development are immensely helpful. This is something we actually tried to do, but unfortunately some of those sub-regional heads actually disappeared, which wasn't so great. But I highly recommend doing that for anybody who wants to start their own mod on a large scale. Another thing to do, though, is to recognize individual regions as sort of projects within themselves. So one of the problems we've had is that we have individual people each developing their own tag. But when these guys have their own visions, it's hard to connect everything together, as we actually wanted to do with China. And so that's still the goal, but we've had a problem with that. And so I think we should have actually focused on regions first and said, we're going to assign 4 people to focusing on this region, and then have them focus on the tags in particular, which I also cover in that third point there. So this is actually how we kind of divided China up, as you can see, sort of into these regions. And again, unfortunately, people ended up disappearing a little bit. We also have something called the proposal system. So whenever somebody wants to make a substantial change to a tag or to something really key to the mod, we ask that they write up a document. A pretty long document. And this actually does a couple things. It sets clear expectations. It permits us some kind of review prior to actually coding it. It provides reference material for future coders in case this person disappears off the planet or somebody comes back years later and needs to know what was done. And also it provides sort of a baseline. So you can say, a month down the line, if things have gone in kind of a weird direction, you can say, wait a minute, this isn't quite in line with what you said you were going to do. So you can see an example of these. Oh, I realize I've been behind like this whole time. I apologize, guys. Here you can see an example of the table of contents of one of our documents. And as you can see, these get pretty detailed. We talk about a whole bunch of different things. And actually, we even sort of map out how we want our events and things to work. We also have to track progress, of course. And this does a couple different things. We can set these specific tailored goals. We can check in personally with coders. And we can set up a sort of a tracking document. Though formal progress reports do not necessarily work. Asking people to fill out these specific things like every week or every month, people don't really like doing that. We learn that through experience. And you can see here an example of one of our sort of tracking documents. So all of that aside, and again, I apologize for the confusion with this display that I have not worked with before. The China Rework should be coming to you probably within the next 2 months, probably November or December 2019. But we do always say soon, plus 2 weeks, because, well, this is modding. As I've mentioned, we have all of these sort of inherent challenges with what we're doing. So I can't guarantee that, but that is where I think things will end up. So I hope you'll join us, maybe later on if there's some time after this presentation, at our booth where you can actually play the China Rework for yourselves. Thank you very much.
Pass the ammunition. Follow, like, subscribe, or dash over to our Alt History webshop.